Hello, I'm delighted to moderate this panel for the 14th INSS Annual Conference entitled The World Between Trump and Biden. My name is Dan Shapiro. I'm a visiting fellow at INSS and previously served as the U.S. Ambassador to Israel. Every new American administration raises questions about changes in U.S. foreign policy. A new president puts his, and we hope someday her, stamp on their approach to the world with appointments to senior positions, early calls and visits with heads of state, and declarations of key goals. But perhaps not since the end of the Cold War has a new U.S. administration taken office in an international environment that has changed so radically since the previous administration began its work. Some of those changes are the results of specific policies and choices pursued by President Trump. Some are the results of the moves of other international players, and some of uncontrollable events like the pandemic and climate change. But all of them confront President Biden with challenges, opportunities, and important decisions. We have a very distinguished panel to help us understand how the transition from Trump's to Biden's foreign policy will play out and how other actors in Europe, Russia, and China will respond, including on key challenges in the Middle East. To save time, I'm not going to read our panelists' impressive full bios, but just to introduce them briefly, we are joined by Congressman Ted Deutsch of Florida, a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who serves as the chairman of the influential Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism Subcommittee. Danielle Pletka is a senior fellow in foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, a program which she directed at AEI until 2020. She teaches at Georgetown University and served for many years as a senior professional staff member for the Middle East and South Asia for the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Boris Makarenko is the president and CEO of the Center for Political Technologies, a Moscow-based independent think tank. He is also a professor of comparative politics at the Moscow Higher School of Economics. Ambassador Eyal proper is my colleague at INSS, where he is a senior research fellow and head of China research. He had a long career in the Israeli Foreign Service, where he specialized primarily in China and arms control matters, including 3 terms of service in China, culminating in serving as Consul General in Shanghai. And Natalie Tocci is director of the Italian think tank, the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome, an honorary professor at the University of Tübingen. She is a special advisor to EU High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Josep Borrell, and served in a similar capacity for his predecessor, Federica Mogherini. So without further ado, let me turn to the panelists. Congressman Deutsch and Danielle Pletka, we're fortunate to have both of you because it gives us a bipartisan perspective. Congressman Deutsch, you're a Democrat. Danielle Pletka, you worked for senators on the Republican side of the aisle. And I'd like each of you to describe your view of the international environment that President Biden inherits from the Trump administration and how that shapes the foreign policy priorities of the Biden administration and their chances of success in achieving their goals. Congressman Deutsch, we'll start with you.
Well, thanks, Dan, and thanks for having me. And I want to thank Ms. Pletka and Ambassador Proper and Ms. Tocci and Professor Makarenko. It's good to be with all of you. You ask, I think, the most important question, Dan. The new president is walking into office facing, I would call it a disordered international environment. The world features a rising China, Russia that increasingly, as we have experienced here just recently, uses tools like cyber and disinformation undermine democracy, both the efforts here and in our allies, and transnational threats like the pandemic and climate change. The president has been really clear throughout his career about how he approaches the world. He seeks an engaged and consistent and stabilizing international role for the United States after 4 years of chaotic leadership under President Trump. And I think the new president's going to recommit to our international partnerships. He's made that clear. He did that already among his first executive orders, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, rejoining the World Health Organization. He recognizes the importance of alliances like NATO. So he's not going to return to the pre-Trump status quo. That's impossible given the way things change in the world. They understand that we've got to take a firmer stand against China, specifically Chinese efforts to establish hegemony in East Asia. I also expect the president to take a tougher line on Russia, specifically Moscow's disinformation campaign and election meddling, Vladimir Putin's authoritarianism, whether the destabilization of countries in the region or oppression of activists, the Navalny affair, and responding to the cyber attack on the United States will both be front and center in the early days of this administration. And finally, I think the president speaks eloquently and frequently about making U.S. policy, foreign policy, work for the middle class as well. So I think he's going to try to make international engagement work for the American people. And when he talks about bringing democracies together, it's going to be part of, I hope, and I know that the new administration will work toward a more unified and bipartisan approach to the world. And I look forward to those changes and look forward to being a part of that.
Thank you. Danny, same question to you.
I don't agree that the immediate decisions of the Biden administration have been the wisest, and I'll drop into those for a second. But I agree completely with what Congressman Deutsch said about the challenges that the Biden administration is going to face. You know, for us in Washington, there is this conceit that the world revolves around us, and so when a president changes, then the world changes. And of course, that's completely untrue. The challenges that face Donald Trump are the challenges that face Joseph Biden. And so when we think about the rising China, the South China Sea, the Uyghurs, all of those are not going to change. And I think that is probably going to be, once we are shed of the aftermath of this COVID nightmare, that is going to be the global challenge that bedevils the Biden administration, much as it did the Trump administration. Russia, a much lesser power, but nonetheless, a very disruptive leader in Vladimir Putin. And again, we have seen Putin make advances that, frankly, I thought the Trump administration should have been much stronger in resisting throughout the Middle East. So for those of us who care about, the Middle East, seeing Russian bases in Syria, seeing Russian efforts to place itself from Libya to Egypt to Iran is really quite troubling, and no easy answers to these questions. What I really want to emphasize, though, is that as much as many of us bemoan correctly the way in which Donald Trump left office, the reality in foreign policy is that he left a lot of leverage to the Biden administration that I hope the Biden administration will use.
Sure. Natalie, you bring us an important European perspective. So I want to first ask you about transatlantic relations. Relations between the United States and Europe were strained during the Trump administration, whereas President Biden is a familiar figure in Europe who says he wants to strengthen this transatlantic alliance. What do you see as the main contrasts between the two administrations' approaches to Europe, and what are Europeans looking for in the next 4 years?
Well, I would say, Dan, that I think the big difference here is about politics rather than policy. So with the Trump administration, Europeans, and in particular the European Union, for the first time, were considered by the United States as being an adversary, at times even being an enemy. So this went beyond the agreements or disagreements that there was over different policy questions. And, at times, we have a tendency to look at the transatlantic relationship through rose-tinted lenses. Let's not forget that when it comes to policy differences, there have been many of them. But there was a fundamental difference over the last 4 years that now with the Biden administration will return back to essentially looking at the two sides of the Atlantic as belonging to the same family when it comes to identity, when it comes to values. Now, obviously, as I said, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to agree on everything. I could imagine that on most issues regarding sort of Europe and its surrounding regions, there's going to be broad agreement. I can imagine that there are going to be important policy differences when it comes to digital, when it comes to China, when it comes to trade. But those disagreements, those differences are going to be conducted within the confines, if you like, of a family.
Thanks. Let's pull out to some other international perspectives. Dr. Boris Makarenko, I'll turn to you. Many observers would say that Russia benefited from the relationship President Trump sought to maintain with President Putin, while others distinguished between the president's preferences and the administration's policies, which maintain certain pressures on Russia. In either case, What kinds of changes is Russia preparing for in the Biden administration? And what impact do you see the recent poisoning and arrest of Alexei Navalny having on those relations?
Well, let me start probably from a somewhat different perspective. You did mention in the notes we exchanged before the conference the grand bargain between Russian and American administrations. Grand bargain was in high fashion in Moscow, but not yesterday, but 4 years ago. When President Trump was coming to the White House, he was welcomed by the majority of Russian political class for a simple reason. He was not a Democrat. He was neither Barack Obama nor Hillary Clinton. Presumably, it couldn't get worse. That ideas of grand bargain and Trump's conservatism are long out of fashion. If you permit me to quote from a recent article by Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia and currently serving as deputy chairman of National Security Council, he said that all the recent years, Trump's years, the relationship between Moscow and Washington was steadily declining, irrespective of who was in power. That's not the end of our quotation, and there's some hope further down. But I guess there is no reason to expect dramatic changes. If there were a few fields where American policies were bipartisan in Trump's years, it was a policy on Russia. Although, of course, the role of President Trump and his personality and his personal relationship with the Russian president had its specifics, but the relations continued to deteriorate. The sanctions continued to get tighter and tighter. Consulates were closed in San Francisco and was it Yekaterinburg in Russia, respect. The case of Navalny. Well, the rhetoric of Russian political class these days is quite confrontational. They talk about interference of Biden's administration in Russia's upcoming Duma elections next September started even before Joe Biden won the elections, but it mostly serves the domestic agenda. That's where Mr. Navalny comes in. My intuition that it's just another brick in the wall of mistrust between the two states, a huge one. And of course, we'll hear the name of Mr. Navalny in exchanges between Moscow and capitals in Europe and North America in upcoming months, but I wouldn't concentrate too much on this one factor.
Okay. Eyal proper, you don't speak for the Chinese, but you know China well from many years of service on behalf of the Israeli Foreign Ministry in China. In your estimation, do the Chinese perceive differences between the Trump and the Biden approaches, or has the idea of a global strategic rivalry with China in its security, economic, technology, and human rights dimensions taken hold of bipartisan thinking in Washington in such a way that there will be more continuity than change?
It will be continuity. It will be continuity not because it is only started with Trump. It was started, this kind of strategic competition between China and the United States started even earlier, even during the Bush administration and later by Obama administration. There were a lot of differences between China and the United States. But what would change? What would change? That China became much stronger, and the United States during Trump administration put the mirror in front of the Chinese, in front of the world, and in front of the Americans. But the way that Trump did it was not in a very, it was not in the way that he made it very consistency. He did it in his last term, exactly as Danny said. He made it in the last term of his time. He didn't do it in the way that was very consistent, but he put the mirror in the fact that China of 20 or 10 years ago, it's not the same China, and China is very strong today. And China is a very, very much competitive rivalry to the United States. And what we have now, when we have a new administration, we have China with much more a self-respect of themselves. They believe that they learned a lesson from Trump administration, and they believe that they should build more on the self-reliance relating advanced technology, and they believe that they can do it by themselves. They believe that they are strong. And let me also, as our Russian colleague, quote from the Russian papers. So let me tell you that what the Chinese editorial made yesterday, they said that United States, the Trump administration, overestimate the ability to contain China. They didn't understand that China is more powerful today. And they didn't understand that they couldn't weaken China. And China today, they mentioned, is 55% of the wealth as United States. If the GDP of China increased to be today around 70% of United States. So this is something Chinese put to themselves, put to the world, and they said, we can today compete United States, and this is what they plan to do. There are a lot of divergences between United States and China, and the Biden administration should decide in what way they would act in human rights issues relating Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and it's not going to be easy for them because there are a lot of issues on the table, to the Chinese, a lot of issues on the table to Biden administration, and how they can manage together.
Danny, let me come back to you. You raised the Iran deal as a near-term decision point for the Biden administration, and there's a real split between two different groups of U.S. partners when it comes to Iran. The E3 and the EU hated Trump's withdrawal from the deal and welcomed Biden's openness to rejoin it. And for Israel and the Gulf states, it's just the opposite. Both sets of relationships are important to the United States. Is it a zero-sum game, as it seems, or is there an opportunity for Biden to thread the needle and maintain positive coordination with both groups of allies?
Dan, it's a great question. The problem is, I think, that we can't weigh our approach to Iran based on either our good friends in the region or our European allies. We really have to be focused on what is necessary to contain the multidimensional threats that Iran represents. I think the biggest problem with the JCPOA was that it rested on the notion that you can split apart the various baskets, as Dennis Ross likes to say, of Iranian bad behavior, that you could take the nuclear problem and set it apart from the missile problem, apart from the terrorism problem, apart from the regional interference problem, and apart from Iran's domestic behavior. And they really are all intertwined. What I think the Biden administration needs to do is to try to get on the same page, not just with our European allies, all of whom I think see, notwithstanding what Trump's decisions were, see the dangerous aspects, not just of the sunsetting parts of the JCPOA, but also of how it has allowed Iran to continue toward a nuclear breakout and very advanced technical capabilities. What we want is we want to get on the same page as our European friends. We want to get on the same page, if possible, as our regional friends in the Middle East, to understand what it is that we can do to build a path that contains not just Iran's nuclear weapons program, but all of these other malign behaviors. Is that a really tall order? You bet it is. On the other hand, if we do JCPOA 2, Iran deal 2, what we risk is that when Joe Biden isn't president anymore, then the next Republican leader ends up ripping it up just as Donald Trump did. We need something with a little staying power that addresses the real threat, and that's Iran.
Congressman Deutsch, on Iran for you, Trump's maximum pressure sanctions have clearly had a serious impact on Iran's economy. But on the other hand, as President Biden has pointed out, Iran's violations of the JCPOA after the U.S. withdrew from the agreement have brought it back to the threshold of a nuclear weapon. And there's mixed evidence on how Iran's regional behavior has been affected by sanctions, as our Israeli friends know because of the operations they've conducted in Syria. How well did Trump balance those competing factors, and how do you expect President Biden to do so?
Look, the Trump administration clearly had a relentless focus on Iran and worked with Israel and our Gulf partners to contain their regional influence. That's going to continue, and it needs to continue in a Biden administration. Given the trends, I understand why President Biden wants to act to restrain Iran and its growing nuclear program. They've stated their intent, even in on the very first day of the administration. They stated their intent to demand compliance with the deal before moving forward with any sanctions relief, but also talked about lengthening and strengthening the deal, which is something that I know Danny and I and so many others think is a key requirement going forward. So you've got to, I think you can revive nuclear diplomacy with the help of our allies, especially in Europe. You can't do it without consulting with our allies in the region. That's critically important. And then lay the groundwork for additional agreements on other issues. The issue of missiles is now something that matters not just to our regional partners, not just to Israel and the Gulf states, but matters to the Europeans as well. And so as we go forward, we've got to have better coordination. We can't unilaterally or prematurely relinquish the leverage that Danny points out that we have, especially the economic pressure that we have. But as we look at the challenges that Iran faces, the ballistic missile threat, their activities in the region, in our conversations with European ambassadors, they also expressed concerns about these as well. So there is this, I'll finish with this, there is a broad understanding, I believe, among Biden and his advisors, our partners and our allies, both in the Middle East and in Europe, of a need to return to diplomacy to address wider concerns, recognizing that we do have leverage, but also recognizing that the accelerated development of the nuclear program in Iran starts to whittle away at that leverage. We don't want to be in a place where our position is to point to Iran and say, your economy has been weakened. And Iran's response to that is to say, well, here are all of the advances we've made on the nuclear front. How do we resolve this? We've got to tackle all of it. We've got to do it quickly. We've got to do it with our allies from Europe and with the region, both to stop their regional influence, diminish that, and then ultimately win support of Congress to do that and to address the nuclear issues.
Natalie, let me ask you about Iran. The E3 and the EU have remained committed to try to preserve the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, even after President Trump withdrew from it and Iran violated its commitments under the deal. Biden has said he would rejoin the deal in the context of mutual compliance. How will Europeans approach the effort to put this broken agreement back together again? And how will Europeans address opposition to rejoining the deal from Israel and the Gulf states?
Well, yes, indeed. I think this is probably going to be one of the first foreign policy questions on which the Biden administration and Europe are going to be really working hand in hand. Now, as you said, Biden has been fairly clear in what the intention is, and it is a sort of clear compliance for compliance approach. But as we all know, it's easier said than done. So I think, one element of European action alongside the United States and obviously in dialogue with Iran is going to be of a rather technical nature in trying to sort of map out the sequencing of this compliance for compliance, which presumably will need to deliver tangible results ahead of the Iranian presidential election. I'm slightly more pessimistic when it comes to ballistic missiles. I'm far more optimistic when it comes to regional questions and making sure that work track is pursued alongside achievements on the nuclear file.
Boris, Iran might be one of those examples of a point where even while there are significant areas of tension between the United States and Russia, there could also be areas of cooperation. An extension of New START might be another one. But keeping Iran from a nuclear weapon was something that the United States and Russia have worked on in the past. How prepared do you think Russia is to be a cooperative partner with the United States on Iran? And where do you think Russia may seek leverage from that cooperation on other issues, be it Syria, Ukraine, or something else that's important to Russian leaders?
I said I'll return to Mr. Medvedev's article. He continues to say that Russia is ready to work with any president with the United States and is ready to restore cooperation in various fields, but it is not expecting reciprocity from the United States. Russia is an important member of the international regime and international community on Iran. Russia is serious about having this problem solved. So if the United States rejoin this process in one shape, that's a very good area of cooperation. START treaty, or any efforts of nuclear disarmament are absolutely important. It's a top priority from Moscow. We need, it's both in Russian and American interests, to preserve the regime of control over nuclear armaments. What smarter people than me say is that unlike 1970s, when building up this regime of control over nuclear arsenals paved the way for improvement of relations between Moscow and Washington in other fields. It opened way for that period which was called detente in relations. This time, it would be great to have a prolongation of the START treaty and continuation of dialogue on nuclear armaments, but the probability that it will extend to other spheres and seriously influence overall climate of Russian-American relations, that probability is not high. Many problems, including those you also mentioned, are dead-ended.
Okay. Eyal, China was a participant in the P5+1 talks with Iran, but it tended to take a backseat role. But as tensions rise in the strategic rivalry between the United States and China, would Chinese leaders consider changing their approach on Iran or on other issues in the Middle East to try to increase their leverage over the United States?
Then you know that if you ask the Chinese, they would not agree that they took the back seat. They believe this is the way the West look at them. They think that they did a very important job, mainly since Xi Jinping took office in 2012, 2013, and they really assist in the backstage, not in a back seat, in the backstage to bring the Iranian to the agreement in 2015. Therefore, they were very much disappointed in 2017 and the decision of Trump administration to withdraw of this agreement, and they would like very much to see the Biden administration going back. But the Chinese already initiated any kind of idea, any kind of declaration, said Biden administration must come as soon as possible without any preconditions. I don't know how the Chinese would like to work it out, but let me tell you, this can be a very good chance for cooperation, because even during Bush administration and later during Obama administration, the Chinese voted together with the Americans 6 times in the Security Council when it was more important for them to cooperate with the states, for example, to have some points relating to Taiwan, to one China policy. So this is something on the table all the time. And if the Chinese would feel that they have more trust with the Biden administration, that they could gain more for themselves, they would work with them on any kind of solution and they will try to push the Iranian as much as they can gain more in what is called core interest of China. If they can gain something over there, they do it. And let me tell you something more. If the Chinese could succeed in bringing the American to the table and fulfill and to come back to this, it can bring them to decide to go with the Iranian on this 25-year strategic agreement. Up to now, the government in Beijing didn't go forward with this. People don't understand. People said we have already strategic agreement between Iran and China, but it's not correct. The Chinese leadership didn't go with the Iranian eager to have it. So if they succeed to have, they could also for themselves have more economic benefits.
Sure. Well, let's talk about some of the areas where some of those differences within the family still could emerge. 2 global challenges that the Biden administration will have to face and deal with are the global strategic rivalry with China in its security, economic, technology, and human rights dimensions, and an emboldened Russia that challenges both U.S. and European nations and U.S. interests in other regions as well. So on both, Biden is obviously going to seek a common approach with Europe. What differences and what areas of convergence do you see between the Biden and the European approaches on these challenges?
Well, I think that, in fact, both when it comes to Russia and China, the European view has consolidated and it's hardened. So I think on both these questions, actually, there's been intra-European convergence and towards a more, in a sense, sort of hardline approach towards both countries. But that does not mean to say that when it comes to the transatlantic relationship, we're exactly on the same page. Now, I think when it comes to Russia, we will pretty much be on the same page, So there, to be honest, I don't see major differences, major disagreements. I think we're going to be aligned when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Belarus, when it comes to Syria, when it comes to Libya, across the board of Russian action. China, I think there are going to be differences. Now, it doesn't mean to say that there's going to be a divergence, but I think that ultimately the United States and Europe start from two slightly different premises. I think when it comes to the United States, this is, as you said, really viewed through the lens of rivalry. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that China was a shining liberal democracy, and it was rising, and it was overtaking the United States. Would the United States have a problem with this? Well, I would argue that it probably would. Would Europeans have a problem with it? Well, probably not as much.
Congressman Deutsch and Danny Pletka, I want to hear from each of you on maybe the biggest change in the Middle East that Biden will inherit from Trump, and that's the Abraham Accords. How big of a strategic change is that? And what opportunities do you think it creates for the Biden administration on further normalization, on a broadly supported Iran strategy, on addressing Chinese and Russian influence in the region, or on the Palestinian issue? Congressman Deutsch, let's start with you.
It's a major strategic change. It's a really significant opportunity, I think. The normalization agreements greatly benefit regional stability. They benefit our own interests. We all know that Israel's cooperated with regional states on security issues for many years, but seeing that coordination play out openly, expanding it into new avenues, that signifies that the nature of these relationships changes. The Biden team and the new administration has recognized these important steps, praised the Abraham Accords, said they want to build upon them to develop ties between Israel and other Arab states. So I think the president's going to work to support Israel's regional integration and expand this coalition, which first and foremost is important to restrain Iranian influence in the Middle East. The trips, the tourism is great, but the challenge right at the moment is the significant challenge that we've already been talking about is Iran, and fostering activity, developing these relationships, amplifying U.S. Influence. That's all really important. I hope it will also build momentum on the Israel-Palestinian front, something that we can get into if there's more time. But that last point I make on this, Dan, is I don't think that we should believe that this will all just flow naturally. There is an approach to a lot of countries in the Middle East from the Trump administration, which really focused, and we heard President Trump say this over and over about how great these arms sales are. Going forward, arms sales aren't going to drive the decision making in the White House. The positives from the Abraham Accords and what can come by expanding them is what's going to drive this process, and that's going to, I think, yield really significant steps forward, both in the security front and then ultimately beyond that, to strengthen the region as a whole.
I think Biden has a lot of opportunities. The real question is going to be, who wins the great fight in the Democratic Party about the approach to the region. If the Biden administration takes a sensible approach, then what it will do is it won't suddenly turn tables hysterically on the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. It won't suddenly bend to Iranian diktat on how to view the challenges in the region. It will build on what the Trump administration accomplished, and that was A great deal. You know, we all, as the congressman said, we all talk about the tourism, but of course the tourism isn't at the center of it. What is at the center of the new Middle East, and I think we really can call it that, is a recognition that Iran represents the greatest threat, and B, a recognition that the Palestinians, you know, who will never tire of quoting Abba Eban, you know, never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, have continued to miss opportunities to the extent that they have become marginal to the interests of their Arab partners and friends of the past. And now the greatest champion of Palestinians is the country that supports Hamas and Hezbollah, and that is Iran. That's hugely dangerous. Will the Palestinians take advantage of newly called presidential elections to install a new generation that actually wants to grasp opportunities rather than simply exploit the world as it was in 1966? I don't know whether the Biden administration will bring that perspective. Some of the people who I've heard mooted as potential players worry me. Others, like you, Dan, are people in whom I have great confidence for their sensible approach to the Middle East. A lot of that is going to really require, I never thought I would say these words, okay, but is going to require an approach a little bit like that Jared Kushner brought. Shocking. Absolutely shocking to all of us, but a willingness to set aside the formulas and the tropes of the last 50, 60, 70 years and bring fresh eyes to the challenge and see whether we can do something to help the Palestinians help themselves, do something to contain the Iranian threat and help the Iranian people at a time when they are truly oppressed by their regime. All of those are real opportunities. Will the Biden administration take them? I just don't know yet. On the other hand, you know, we're only a few days in. It's not like we can express disappointment, only hope.
I want to thank all our panelists. We're out of time. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and unfortunately, we've just scratched the surface. We could go deep on so many of the issues that were raised. But Danielle Pletka, Congressman Deutsch, Dr. Tocci, Dr. Makarenko, Ambassador Proper, thanks for being with us. Thanks for helping us understand this incredible transition we're going through from the Trump to the Biden administration. And I wish all of you good health and success in the year ahead.